go over this again because we've heard this already a couple of times. It's directed against a national group as an entity, and the attack on individuals is only secondary to this endeavor. Raphael Lemkin, who has been already cited, is often credited for having ushered in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocides, which was adopted in 1948, along with the Human Rights Convention. Now Lemkin, however, when he writes his Axis Rule on Occupied Europe, is very much still thinking about genocide, I would argue, and less about the Holocaust, because after all, he publishes a book in 43, and it's possibly only in 43 that the full scope of the Holocaust becomes further and further visible. Lemkin's concept was therefore not so much formulated at first in response to the Holocaust, but more in response to the genocidal politics of the Third Reich. And I think those two are not always identical. Nonetheless, definitions of genocides and their relationships are to this day complicated, and we've just heard yet another complicating fact if we consider the Sinti and Roma. But I think it is important that even the Nazis, in many ways, whether we go with Browning's ideas of the three clusters or otherwise, differentiated between their genocidal politics and the Holocaust. I'm using just here one of the statements from Marshal von Rundstedt addressing the Reich War Academy in Berlin in 1943. One of the greatest mistakes of 1918, this is obviously also quoted by Lemkin, was to spare the civil life of the enemy countries, for it's necessary for us Germans to be always at least double the numbers of the people of the contiguous countries. We're therefore obliged to destroy at least a third of their inhabitants. The only means is organized under feeding, which in this case is better than machine guns. So this, in lots of ways, is not so much about the Holocaust as in the destruction of Jewish communities, but really about the genocidal politics of the Third Reich as an occupying force, in particular in Eastern Europe. So Lemkin, who uses this quote, thus in many ways associates destruction with what he called the crippling of a group genocide. As he also would write in 1946 when he quotes actually this Rundstedt quote. In contrast, though, the final solution as envisioned at the Wannsee Conference never thought to destroy at least a third of all Jews, but outlined a program for the complete annihilation of all Jews. Unlike other previous genocides that Lemkin had discussed, the Holocaust was also not limited, and I think that's the argument that I think is more important, to a particular geography. So the Armenian genocide was limited to a particular geography, whereas the Holocaust was not. Similarly, because that's often kind of comes together and indirectly came in the first presentation, Winston Churchill's often cited observation, we are in the presence of a crime without a name, referred only to the beginning German atrocities against Jewish and other Russian civilians after the attack on the Soviet Union, and not quite yet on the Holocaust itself. And here again, he, like Lemkin, was reminded of other atrocities, mainly the Mongol invasion of Europe. This is a quote in the 16th century. But be that as it may, even if it is true that, as some historians claim, that Hitler Germany entered the Second World War with a conditional commitment to the Holocaust, and this is most often explained in relationship to this speech that he gives in 1939, which becomes the quote-unquote prophecy. And since Hitler references talk later on, it seems to encapsulate already the plans for the Holocaust. I think it is equally important to recognize that in many ways the Third Reich moved from genocidal practices to the Holocaust only in the fall of 1941. Between the killing squads that descended into genocide and the Wannsee Conference still lay a certain path. There was still a ways to go. And I think Raoul Hilberg described this best as a process of interpreting existing terms that ushered in a radical ongoing radicalization. Quote, they had to become inventive with the final solution. That was their great invention. And that it was made this entire process different from all others that had preceded it. So for Hillenburg, the Holocaust is really the moment where the Nazis go far beyond anything that had ever happened before. For two reasons. Largely, at this point, they're aiming to destroy all Jewish communities, not any longer crippling a community. And two, what they're outlining in the Wannsee Conference is not any longer limited to a particular geography, meaning they are not thinking just about Eastern Europe. And that this kind of extension continues to cause problems is even noticeable from some of the Nazi documents that we have. I'm just quoting one here from Wilhelm Kugel, one of the Nazi chief officials in Minsk, who in October 1941 writes that amongst the German Jews who had now been deported were many who had come from his own culture, many of those who had served in the First World War. And he's troubled by the idea of shooting them all the same. So he still is negotiating this forward move. He's quite willing to go along with the mass shooting and killing of Eastern European Jews, but to extend this now to German Jews and to Western European Jews is still at best for him something that he has to kind of wrap his mind around. So I think here we see this radicalization both in terms of the total destruction that the Nazis are trying to accomplish, as well as this wide open geography that is constantly adjusted in relationship to the changing fortunes of war. So in the summer of 41, for example, they are putting together a killing squad that has the code name Killing Squad Egypt that is supposed to be employed in North Africa and in Palestine. So the potential geography was always wider than the actual geography of the Holocaust. But be that as it may, in 1943, when Olmsted makes this statement on genocidal politics, the Nazis are also reassessing again what they had accomplished. And Himmler instructs one of the key statisticians, Richard Kohr, to write up a report not just about what had been done, but also what still needed to be done. And what is interesting is that in that report, he singles out that within the European countries, only Hungary and Russia and Romania are still centers of large Jewish communities, whereas virtually in all others they had been destroyed as far as communities are concerned. Nonetheless, the report now urges on to also destroy the last remnants of Jews in Belgium and the Netherlands and in Germany, where there are at this point really no large communities left. But be that as it may, however we want to differentiate between genocidal practices that in lots of ways predated the Nazis and the eventual Holocaust, I think this debate, and you kind of already led us into this, is largely a debate about the perpetrators, thinking about genocides and Holocausts in terms of combining crimes, and not thinking about genocide studies also from the perspective of the victims. And I think here, it's interesting to note that when we think about genocides, largely we're really describing this from the perspective of the crimes and not from the perspective of the victims. But I think it's here equally interesting that the mass atrocities of the 20th century at the latest ushered in a new understanding of what we mean by victims and how we deal and treat victims. For starters, starting probably from the 18th century onwards, the very term victim starts to acquire a new meaning. Up until the 18th century, there are a few exceptions to that rule, but by and large, up until the 18th century, the word victim virtually in every language means sacrifice. It's still very much tied to the biblical account of sacrifices. By the 18th century, victim starts to acquire a secular meaning. It is the victim of violence. And more so, in the beginning of the 20th century, where now two more things are happening that I think are equally important. One, the latest after the Great War, there's a recognition that soldiers and these need to be accounted for, and they're dead. But there's equally now an acknowledgement that they are not the only ones who had suffered, but so have civilians. And when we move now forward into the 1977 Geneva Convention and the protection of victims of international armed conflicts, The addition that is made is now that, quote, also the right of families to know the fate of their relatives is in 1979 extended to civilian casualties and to civilian victims. So now it's not any longer that the nation states simply want to account for the war debt, meaning the soldiers, but equally, there's now a right to know as far as the civilians are concerned. So I think there's something quite interesting that is occurring in the 20th century in the way we acknowledge victims and in the way states are trying to extend now that families, for example, have a right to know. But alongside with it comes also a very novel understanding, and that is in many ways that the experience of victims is tied up with what we call trauma. And that became most noticeable already after the First World War, when in particular Freud's early ideas of trauma became more and more widely shared. So much so that in the aftermath of the First World War, it was already a common practice to account now for civilian casualties like in the Armenian genocide. So here we have Aram Antonian, who's collaborating with others in the publication of a memoir from the Armenian genocide, and he's establishing in Paris a library dedicated to the memory of the Armenian genocide, which collects in particular memoirs from survivors. And while he's doing it in Paris, not far away from Paris, across the Rhine in Berlin, there is someone else, Elias Cherikova, who seems to do exactly the same thing. He also creates an archive and becomes a co-founder of YIVO in order to account for the pogroms in the aftermath of the First World War. And again, also this attempt of chronicling and of archiving is built around memoirs and accounts of survivors. So there seems to be an almost innate kind of response that recognizes that one way of dealing with the aftermath now of genocides, or pogroms and atrocities, is to recognize the victims and to account for their respective unique experiences. So much so that when Primo Levi writes his famous "If This Is a Man," he in his preface attributes his writing to the account of atrocities, seeing it already as a well-established genre in which various individuals from various periods have written about their respective accounts. But I think what we don't have is any kind of comparative studies of victims and their particular narratives. We are, when we're thinking about genocides, mostly occupied with the perpetrators, but less so with how victims in the aftermath made sense. Is there a universal language of victimhood? Is trauma expressed in all cultures in the same manners? Is it always textual, or is it also ritual? Is it also performative? We're really at the beginning of barely thinking about this, and I think it has everything to do with us being a little obsessed about only one side of this divide, meaning the perpetrators, and not thinking so much about the other side, meaning the victims as such. Well, we can see that even in the earliest of accounts, here's 1990, there's an acknowledgement that the event was traumatic, but therefore also more pristinely preserved in the memory of the individual. This is one from the Armenian genocide. We can also recognize that in all of the attempts to recall and to enshrine the memory of genocides, there's almost a universal language right now in museums. Whether it's for Nanjing, here the Archive of Names in China, or obviously the more famous, the Archive of Names and Faces in Yad Vashem, or indeed here the names and faces of Rwanda. The recalling and reclaiming the names and the faces of individuals is quite clearly part of the universal language nowadays of how we're dealing with this in the aftermath. But we have yet to study why we do this and how it translates into accounting for what had actually happened to these victims. Let me therefore close in a slightly odd way with two other last references. Our ideas about aesthetics have always been tied up with this particular text, and more so with this particular sculpture. This is a sculpture from the 200 BCE, which becomes very famous in the debates about Greek aesthetics in the 18th century in the writing of a German philosopher called Lessing. And Lessing uses this text as a way of differentiating how the different arts, the sculptures, the poems articulate what they are trying to communicate in their own unique ways. But at the centerpiece of this debate is how pain is a central component of the sculpture. Here's our good-meaning man who wants to warn Troy about the Trojan horse and says, no, it's filled with soldiers and nobody listens to him, and therefore he gets punished by the serpents that kind of bite him on both sides. And so therefore you have this timeless quality of his pain that is a central piece of this depiction. But if it's the pain that is artistically here represented, then I think I would argue that exists altogether on a different level than our histories does. It is in many ways a quite timeless presence, because by looking at it, the agony of our hero is as much with us today as it will be tomorrow and another 100 years' time. And I think in many ways some of other artists, Boltanski in particular, has already gone after this, that this agony and pain of victims exists in a timeless manner because it ultimately articulates the lives that were never lived out. This is a photo collage that he puts together based on photos of kids that celebrated Purim in 1939 in France, and then he alters and manipulates the pictures a little bit and puts them together so that they're not quite any longer the pictures that originally were in the photo of 1939, but that they have become our memory of sorts. Thank you very much.